Alright, so I'm gonna try to do a better job than I did last time discussing the Hobbit trilogy. Because I kind of ranted and swore a lot, and a lot of my friends were like, dude, you can't do that. Like, you gotta make an articulate argument, so do it again. And in hindsight, I'm like, you know what? I would like to do it again, because I've thought about it for a while, and I have a lot on my mind about the Hobbit trilogy. And simply put, I feel like a majority of Hobbit fans are in denial about the Hobbit trilogy being horrible, and I've seen it before with the Star Wars prequels, so I feel like that's what's going on with the Hobbit fans. They are still in that it's shiny new, it's not so bad mindset. And to be quite honest, if you compare The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings, it is incomparable. Like, they don't look the same, and they don't feel the same, and they're just very different. And Peter Jackson basically became George Lucas in front of our very eyes. So if you look at Lord of the Rings and compare the use of green screen to The Hobbit, it is night and day. You can see the behind-the-scenes making of The Hobbit, and they've got green screen everywhere, which in Lord of the Rings, that's not how they handled Edoras and the Two Towers. Like, they built it on top of a mountain and got in a helicopter outside and filmed it. Whereas in The Hobbit, it's all just going to be CG now. The Hobbit was also filmed, much like when Star Wars came out and George Lucas was like, digital, digital, digital. Peter Jackson did what with The Hobbit? He was like 48 frames 3D, 48 frames 3D. So, to be quite honest, that's why Star Wars doesn't match visually, and that's also why The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit don't match visually. The Lord of the Rings was filmed 24 frames a second on film, and The Hobbit was filmed 48 frames and 3D with two cameras and a mirror and a bunch of, an odd setup, let's call it that. Another thing that's similar with The Hobbit and Star Wars is that in the Star Wars prequels, they never made a clone trooper, and for real, they're all CG, and that's part of why the clone troopers, to me, are lifeless and not as fun as the stormtroopers from the original Star Wars trilogy. They did the same thing with The Hobbit, where in the original Lord of the Rings, they put really burly dudes and scary makeup, and it was awesome. And in The Hobbit, they decided, let's just do CG. And, yeah, they made all the enemies CG, so you're watching all these live actors fight kind of cartoon characters that don't quite match. Which, once again, in Lord of the Rings, you would not have had happen. They were fighting real stuntmen in real costumes. So, this is what I mean when I say it's incomparable. And also that Hobbit fans are slightly in denial. Now, if you were to compare everything side by side, like, hey, which Gandalf is cooler, the Gandalf in The Hobbit or the Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, I imagine that most people would say the Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings. So, you would have something along those lines. And I feel like it's kind of that way with most simple side-by-side comparisons, whether you're going to do it with the fight scenes or the cinematography. I feel like Lord of the Rings has easily 3 times more like helicopter shots outside than the Hobbit trilogy does. It's drastic, the difference, The Hobbit just doesn't really have real outdoor helicopter shots. There are always helicopter shots in CG environments, so it just doesn't have the same feel as having a guy gallop on a horse, outside in some epic environment. So, visually, it also doesn't really quite match. Really, Peter Jackson seems to have gotten older and lazier, or he just became George Lucas, take your pick. Maybe people didn't question him enough. But, going back to the side-by-side comparison, compare the romances from the 2 trilogies. The romance in The Lord of the Rings is Aragorn and Arwen, and the romance in The Hobbit is the elf chick who's Tauriel. Yeah, sorry, because they made her up. Tauriel. And, Kili? That's the romance in The Hobbit. So if you were to compare those 2 romances side by side, I'm pretty positive if you have a brain, you will go with the Aragorn-Arwen romance as being far deeper and richer and more fulfilling. With an actual payoff. Anywho. And And the fact that the plot of The Lord of the Rings is actually about saving the world, which it is not about in The Hobbit. In The Hobbit, it's rather confusing almost. What is the point of the trilogy? What is the story trying to tell? Is The Hobbit a cautionary tale of greed, that trilogy? Or is The Hobbit just the hero's journey and learning how to be, like, a grown-up? Like, what is The Hobbit about? Because honestly, I really couldn't tell you. What is it about? You know? Like, what is the moral of the story? I know what the moral of the story in Lord of the Rings is. It's the idea of, like, you have to fight evil. You can't just hope, you know, your problems will go away. Like, you have to combat it. And, you know, good will beat evil in the end. Yada, yada, yada. Sacrifice. Some people never get to come home from war and, you know, live the same life. They're PTSD'd out. There's a lot of things in Lord of the Rings that I could cite. But I'm like, in The Hobbit, when I think about it, I'm like, I don't know what the point of that movie was. I really don't. Like, what was the point of that movie? The quest was literally about, just Bilbo being like, okay, I gotta go with these dwarves because these dwarves want a gem. And then by the time the dwarves get to the gem, they forget about the gem. And then it's not about the gem anymore. And then Bilbo goes home. And he does get the ring along the way, but I mean, ultimately, maybe that was the point of the trilogy, is just to show Bilbo get the ring, but that's nowhere near as fulfilling as Lord of the Rings, you know, which is about defeating, you know, the last great evil, or like a very dark, old, powerful, you know, spiritual evil. You know, whereas The Hobbit is kind of like a treasure hunt. I don't think The Hobbit is entirely terrible. Like, it does have merit. I feel like the guy that plays Bilbo, whose name I'm forgetting right now, he did a really good job. And that's about it, to be perfectly honest, because I don't prefer the fights or the cinematography or the look of it or how the movies were cut up into 3 movies and where they decided to end the second one and start the third one. Like, it would literally be like, it would be like if in Lord of the Rings, they stopped the movie during the Helm's Deep fight. And then we're just like, yeah, we'll see the end of the Helm's Deep fight at the beginning of Return of the King. That's like literally what they did in The Hobbit with the Smaug sequence. So, it's just such a mess. And I didn't know that Alfie guy, I think I complained in the last video about, like, that piece of shit guy, Alfred, who was, like, you know, useless, and what was he there for? I later found out he was there for comic relief, and I was like, oh, I had no fucking idea, because he wasn't funny to me. I didn't know. He was like Jar Jar Binks, as far as I'm concerned. So this is also why I'm like, dude, it's just like Star Wars prequels. And I don't know about you guys, maybe some people like the Star Wars prequels, but, like, I grew up with the original Star Wars trilogy, and to me, it's incomparable. Like, they don't look the same, they don't feel the same. It's like a different guy made them with different priorities. And it's really how I feel about The Hobbit. Like, I just have no urge to, like... I was literally going to do a fan edit of The Hobbit, and I'm still thinking about doing it because I like doing fan edits, and I haven't figured out a place to post them yet, because YouTube will not let me. But getting sidetracked, I was thinking about doing a fan edit of The Hobbit, and I really just don't want to sit through, like, the extended cuts of those 3 movies and, like, capture them, put them on my computer, sit through them, edit them down. Like, part of me is just like, man, that last Hobbit movie is so terrible that I don't know how I would clean that ending up, you know, because I'm like, the fight is terrible, and the way everyone dies is terrible, and it's just stupid. It's almost like no fixing it, kind of. I just feel like the fights look terrible. Bob Anderson died. So Bob Anderson's the guy that choreographed the sword fights in Lord of the Rings, and he's the guy that choreographed the sword fights in the 1938 Robin Hood movie, which I reviewed. And he's the guy that choreographed the sword fights in the Zorro movies with Antonio Banderas, and he's the guy that did the sword fights for the movie First Night with Richard Gere and Sean Connery, and he's the guy that did the sword fights for the Three Musketeers movie, Alla Triste with Viggo Mortensen, and he's the guy that did the sword fights for Rob Roy, and he's the guy that did the sword fights for Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy, and he's the guy, and the list goes on and on and on. So they didn't have that old man who had been around literally since the 1930s doing sweet sword fights. They didn't have him around for The Hobbit. So I don't know who they got to replace him, but that, in combination with the CG bad guys, really makes those fight scenes lackluster. So I feel like the Hobbit trilogy doesn't match Lord of the Rings on any conceivable level. other than maybe Gandalf plays the same guy and Elrond is the same guy and Galadriel's the same guy. But, oh, and Saruman's there. But to be honest, the last 10 years or so have not been kind to Christopher Lee or Ian McKellen, and God bless both of them. They're legends, and I love them, but like the last 10 years have not been kind. So it's kind of painful to watch The Hobbit first, because you're like, God, Gandalf looks fucking old. It's weird to watch Lord of the Rings after watching The Hobbit, because you really will feel like Gandalf looks fresh and young in comparison, which I always felt like Gandalf looked ancient when I first saw Lord of the Rings, but now after seeing The Hobbit, I'm like, dude, he looks young in Lord of the Rings. So, yeah. Anywho, I do think Hobbit fans are in denial. I'm sorry to be the one to break the news, but I don't want to watch the Hobbit trilogy again, to be perfectly honest. And I did see it in theaters the way it was meant to be seen, so it's not like the small screen ruined it. Like, it had my undivided attention. And I just thought it was terrible. Just terrible. I don't know why Orlando Bloom is in that movie, and I do like it, but I don't know why he's there, and I don't know why that elf chick is there, and there's just so many things where I'm like, why are they there? I don't like that Bard is, like, a main character in the movie. And even though Bard is, like, cool in the movie, he's not the worst thing in the trilogy. I'm just like, dude, in the book, he was just a dude that just kind of showed up and killed that dragon like a badass, no big D. And that was kind of profound, because you were just like, oh, some random stranger saved us. You know, you kind of learned a weird lesson in that. But that's completely gone in the movies, because Bard is now, like, a main character with a family, and yada, 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 yada. They're trying to make him like Aragorn, basically, and I thought Thorin was supposed to be Aragorn for the Hobbit trilogy, but then they tried to make like Bard Aragorn, and I'm like, I just got confused. And Thorin's character was just so. I was always curious how they were going to handle that theoretically, but after seeing how they actually executed it, I'm like, God, they did a bad job. They did a really bad job showing Thorin turn bad, and then they later apologized for it. Like, they really missed the mark on that. And yeah, compare like freaking Boromir's death to Thorin's death. And it's pretty incomparable. So I just feel like everything you would compare with using relativity, which is how we measure space and time, by the way, relativity. I feel like if you compare The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings relativity-wise, then, God, The Hobbit just is horrible. Like, it really falls apart. And, yeah. Anyhow, hopefully this was a more calm, articulate way of me expressing myself on the Hobbit trilogy. And I'm sorry, Peter Jackson, I really am, because I do love Lord of the Rings, and I will defend that movie trilogy series till the day I die. So please don't hate me, Peter Jackson, because I love Lord of the Rings, but I do not like The Hobbit, and I'm sorry, I really don't, and I'm not going to front like I do, so. Anywho, everyone have a happy Valentine's Day.